Hey everyone, we're back with the Civil War. After 70 years of debate over the issue of slavery, the Union had now fallen apart after the election of 1860, and both sides entered the war with very high hopes, each convinced they would prevail easily over the other. It was the Union side, after all, as you can see from the slide here, that had many advantages over the Confederate States of America. The bulk of the population lived in Union territory. Over 90% of all factory production was in the Northeast, in the upper Midwest. The railroad tracks, you can see they have more access to this vital transportation network. The Union does. Essentially, by almost every measure, the Union dominated the South. Over 97% of weapons produced in the United States were produced in Union territory. So at the start of the war, Lincoln was pretty optimistic that his call for 75,000 recruits would that they would only see service for maybe 90 days before the rebellion would be put down. However, the war will drag on much longer than that for a variety of reasons. And as the war begins to drag on, fatigue starts to set in the northern states. A war that was initially deemed for holding the Union together, it was about the illegality of secession, once the war becomes about slavery in particular, we'll talk about that here in just a minute with the Emancipation Proclamation, it will anger many northern whites. We're going to see draft riots in New York City, for example, in the summer of 1863. They're going to burn an orphanage down for black children. A lot of resentment building in the Northeast as this war continues to drag on and ultimately is made about ending the institution of slavery. Lincoln does not start the war, though, for that reason, mainly because he knew things like this would happen. He understood that racism was a nationwide phenomenon. So initially the war is about holding the Union together. Lincoln is also very cautious in not making the war to start with about slavery because he's worried about the so-called border states. You can see them listed on the map here. Those areas that were on the border between the Confederacy and the northern states of the Union, slavery existed in these border states. And he was worried that if he came out against slavery at the get-go, then he risked antagonizing these border states and having them flip and join the Confederacy. So it won't be until 1863 that the Emancipation Proclamation will be issued that will free slaves in federally occupied territories, but notice, not in the border states. Again, Lincoln is treading very carefully to make sure that those border states don't get angry and join the Confederacy at this point. But he will now, with this document, make the war clearly about ending the institution of slavery, and in doing so he'll scare away both Britain and France, which were huge trading partners of the American South that they relied very heavily upon its cotton. Now, by making the war about ending slavery, Britain and France, both with very healthy abolitionist movements, they're not going to touch the South. They're not going to provide it with any goods that they need to keep fighting the war. So that's what I mean by Lincoln issued the proclamation as much for strategic as for moral reasons. Now, the Union Army strategy was to take the fight to southern soil. So, as you can see from the map here, essentially they're going to create a blockade of many southern port cities to try and choke off trade, to not allow the South to sell its cotton to make money, to not allow the South to import manufactured goods. And they're also going to begin invading regions of the South, and in particular they want control of the Mississippi River, which basically, if they can cut off the Mississippi River, they can cut the Confederacy in two, between an eastern half and a western half. So theirs is the Anaconda Plan, so named after the snake that famously kills its prey by sort of gripping it to death, squeezing it to death. Now, this strategy will immediately start causing hardships for the South. Shortages of food leads to starvation in some areas. Poor nutrition leads to higher rates of disease. The South will start suffering because they do not have the manufacturing that the North has. They cannot sell their cotton or tobacco or indigo to get many of the foodstuffs that they need to feed their home population. So morale in the South is going to start taking a nosedive pretty quickly. This is complicated by the fact that since much of the fighting was done on Southern soil, it's tearing up farmland, it's tearing up cities. This is only making the economic situation of the South that much worse over time. You'll see food riots, for example, breaking out in places like Mobile, Alabama, Atlanta, and Richmond in 1863. Making matters worse was the fact that the Confederate government, in a desperate attempt to try and kind of keep their economy afloat with no way to sell many of their goods abroad, they're going to start printing off Confederate dollars, leading to runaway inflation. Confederate currency during the war became virtually worthless. They were printing off in Richmond, they were printing off all these Confederate dollars with no actual hard currency to back it up with, no gold reserves, no silver reserves. This led to an incredibly high rate of inflation. Overall, for example, during the Civil War, within Union territory in the North, there was 80% inflation in the cost of many basic goods due to shortages. In the South, however, in the Confederate states, they experienced a 9,000% inflation rate for basic foodstuffs and basic goods. So, as you can see, this is not good. Added to the fact that over time, as the Anaconda Plan, the Union's strategy to kind of choke off the South, as it starts to really take effect, it leads to a higher death count. What we're going to see in 1863 is General Robert E. Lee, leading the Army of Northern Virginia, on behalf of the Confederacy, will make kind of a last-ditch effort to change the tide of war. Instead of being constantly forced into retreat, what Lee is going to do is take the battle to northern soil. He's going to try and push through at the small market town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, his push to change the tide of the war didn't work, and we're going to see an incredibly high death toll. More than 50,000 Americans killed during just 3 days worth of fighting, July 1st through July 3rd, 1863. And it's just going to be a pretty bleak scene during this period. By the summer of 1863, essentially what the Union has done is take control of the Mississippi Valley. As you can see from the map here, this is huge. When the Union captures the Mississippi Valley and Vicksburg falls in the summer of 1863, they have now split the Confederacy in half. Now the western half of the Confederacy cannot supply the eastern half of the Confederacy. This is a huge blow for them and a huge success from the standpoint of Union battle strategy. Next on the agenda will be General William T. Sherman, making his steady march down from Tennessee to Atlanta, Georgia, which at that time was a major railroad hub of the Confederacy and as a result a strategic target for the Union armies. So what we'll see is Sherman, with about 62,000 men, began descending on Atlanta. Will ultimately take the city between July and September of 1864. They will not stop there. He and his men, moving along a front about 60 miles wide, advancing about 10 miles a day, will then continue sweeping through southern Georgia. Their ultimate destination will be the very important port city of Savannah, Georgia, which will be taken on December 21st, 1864, when Union General William T. Sherman will telegraph the president and basically say that he's delivered Savannah into his hands as a Christmas present, an early Christmas present. Keep in mind, too, that 1864 is another presidential election year. Yes, there's a war raging, but the election went forward as it should have. What Lincoln will experience, he'll of course be running for a second term in office. The successes of Sherman in the South will definitely help catapult him into a second term in the presidency. This is real progress from the standpoint of Northerners. They're seeing that the Confederacy is slowly crumbling in this sustained assault at the hands of Union forces. And so the following spring, in April of 1865, the head of the Confederate forces, Robert E. Lee, will meet with the head of the Union forces, Ulysses S. Grant, at a courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. According to Robert E. Lee, he said the following, quote, "After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources." This is it. With the stroke of a pen, the Civil War will finally come to a close, but not without a grisly toll. More than 600,000 men died in action or of disease, and in all, more than 1,000,000 Americans were killed or seriously wounded. The monetary cost of this protracted conflict was to the tune of about $15 billion. However, for the 4 million slaves in the South, no price was too great to pay for their final freedom, which will be secured through the enactment of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in December of 1865. Slavery will finally be outlawed in the United States once and for all. Next, we need to turn to the era known as Reconstruction, when the nation will try to piece itself back together after this long tumult of war.